And we're here tonight to stand with the Wampanog. And we're here tonight to let them know that the people of the Quechan Islands are with them and support their struggle, and are here for them until the bitter end. So thank you. So without any further ado, will we hear from Mr. Chucky Green.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you all very much for coming, and I too offer my thanks to the college and all of their staff for allowing us to have this time and to be able to help and educate the people of Cape Cod to where we come from, who we are, and why the sound is important to our tribe. My name is George Chucky Green. I am the Tribal Historic Preservation Authority for the Mashpee Wampanog tribe. I am also the Natural Resources Assistant Director for the Mashpee Wampanog tribe. So I have the good fortune to now be able to do something that I did for free for 30 years and actually collect a paycheck. So if any of you are wondering how I'm getting rich at this job, well, first of all, you're wrong, because it doesn't get that well. Tonight, I'm here to try to convey our culture, history, and religion, and our connection to Nantucket Sound. This is something that's very important to me. People say that we have come along the tribes as late bloomers and last minute people to enter into this discussion. I take offense to that, first of all. The tribe has a long history, and I'd like to, right now, try to establish a timeline. But first European contact here in the United States is celebrated as the arrival of Columbus, and that would be 1492. So that would give us, since contact, 517 years. Second contact here in Massachusetts is 1620. So if we move up to that one, we're at 389 years. Well, the Wampanog people have occupied this land for 13,000 years. Take that and think about it. The amount of time that the Wampanog people have existed here. We have evidence to prove that Horseshoe Shoals was above ground for 6,000 years. So if we take that and we think about that number, well, we've been around for 12,000. We lived on the Sound for 7,000. 10,000 years ago, 10,000 years before the birth of Christ, we were there. We were on the Sound. We were living there. Our people lived there, walked those lands, raised their families, hunted, fished. And it was because the glaciers had drawn back the water. The ground was there. We were coastal people. We moved out to the coast. Martha's Vineyard in Nantucket and Horseshoe Shoals were hills and valleys. They were the place where we gathered our foods, chopped wood, built homes, raised families. For 7,000 years. The United States holds no candle to that. Most cultures can't trace back to that far. When we first opened discussions about the Sound, the Aquinah, Tippos, and myself discussed that our oral histories told us this, that our legends told us this, told us that we existed out here, and this was a part of us for way before time that we knew. This has been a part of who we are. The sound defines us. We are the people of the first light, people of the dawn. I don't know how to explain it any better than the name that was given to us. But we all need to remember that for 7,000 years, and that's what I want everyone to think about. 7,000 years we lived there. So you know that we have burials out at that place. You know that that is someplace that is sacred to the tribes, and something that we didn't just think about and become the Johnny-come-latelys. We've been discussing these issues with the government since the 80s, talking about making the Sound into a national sanctuary, talking about ways of protecting our ancestors. We've been in this discussion for a long time. The process that was supposed to protect our rights. Well, step one of that process was to initiate that process. Well, that process was not initiated for us by the agencies. The second part of that was to identify the historic properties and apply the National Register criteria. That was something else that was put off and is now coming to fruition. The third part was to assess the adverse effects and then resolve those effects. If that resolve could not happen, then it was to go to the Park Service. Well, folks, that's where we are. We're at step 4 in a 6-step process. And we should be at the end of the process after the many years that they say we've been in the process. But we've just gotten invited into the process. We have, as tribes, written our responses to the DEIS, to the EIS. We have participated in every opportunity that they've given us. There's not much more I can say about the process, and I really don't care to go into the little ins and outs of the process. But the tribes, we don't feel that in this process we've received our due. And we look to save our Sound. Our Sound has a strong religious attraction to us. The first light. We are the people of the first light. Let me make this clear. That morning horizon sunrise is a part of our ceremony. The celestial happenings that happen over the sun are a part of our ceremonies. Putting a large lighted power plant in the middle of this situation would be detrimental to our culture. It would make us unable to pass that culture on to our children and our grandchildren. We the people of the first light. We the people that met the pilgrims. We the people that supported the pilgrims in their quest for religious freedom now stand in a position where our religious freedoms are being threatened. I don't know how everyone in this room feels. I don't know a lot of people in this room. And I hope that you all listened to me and thought about what I've had to say. Because if we do even get the designation as being a traditional cultural place, it's still going to be up to the Secretary to decide if that is taken from us. Everything that we have has been taken from us. We were even given a town, 22 square miles, forever. Well, I think the way it was put was, till the rivers don't run, till the wind doesn't blow. I don't know, Jim, maybe be able to correct me on that one. I think that's how it was put, but it was put as forever. I guess we don't understand forever, because that's not what we have now. We have a small portion of a great town, and I am, like Wampanogs have been in all of our history, willing to share that town with the people who dwell there with me now, and make it the best that it can be. I'm looking right now to preserve a resource that's connected to me, my culture, my religion, but also a resource that we also share with everyone in this room, with everyone on Cape Cod, with everyone for thousands of miles away. It's a national treasure. If the keeper decides, then we need every person then to come forward and step up and support that decision of the keeper. And let's place this wind park in a place where it would be better. We've offered the tribes. We went to the alternatives. We offered alternatives that are viable, alternatives that would work, alternatives with better wind. We have better wind, and that's been documented. When they did the first research, they checked the wind all the way around the outside of the Cape, all the way around the outside of the islands. The best wind is not located in horseshoe shoals. We need to think of our other neighbors, the 1,200 fish that we put out of work, that are feeding their families. I didn't even want to get this far into the little pros and cons, and I had actually told David I wasn't going to, but I'm kind of caught up in this, and this is my home. I love the Cape. I will always be here. I will raise my grandchildren here, and I will raise my grandchildren in the Wampanog tradition. All I can ask is the support of everyone else. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chuck. At this time, I'd like to invite Bettina Washington up from the Aquinah tribe of the Wampanog, Martha Vineyard.
Good evening. I'd like to thank everybody for coming. I'd like to thank Cape Cod Community College for this opportunity to educate. I feel this is something that needs to be done after all the editorials, all the newspaper articles. It's a learning experience for me as a child historic preservation officer, and I believe it's been a learning experience for the agency, and it continues to be a learning experience for the public. This is really a ruse. I don't have anything to say. But I have to agree with everything Chucky said. We have been here a long time. We are an old people. And when we talk about the sound, I don't know if any of you have been to Martha's Vineyard in the summer, but, okay, I'm not to say it. For over a half a century, we have put on a pageant, which is Legend of Mashpee. That is our oral history. And it tells how we came from the mainland, walked over the sound, and Mashpee made the waters rushing out. So he created Nopi, Martha's Vineyard. He created no man's land. That's a crab. Elizabeth Arms are his footsteps. Nanntucket is a bride's dowry. Because for us, it's the mother's line that carries and holds the land. All these things we've been telling for years. But no one's listening. Or it was just a story. And I can understand that. It may seem like a story to everyone else. But to us it's real. It's our history. So when it came time for this process, no one listened to it. Again. 2004, Cheryl Andrews Maltese, the previous tipper who is now our chair, stated that Nantucket Sound was a traditional cultural property. 5 years ago. We are not joining her lately. The fact that nobody listened to us is not our fault. I just want to make that very clear. So now, everybody gets to learn what a traditional cultural property is and how important it is to us. Because it's not, while it is ceremony, and while it does somewhat equate to religion as the general public knows, these practices are our life. It is what makes us want to know it. These practices are something that is our responsibility. Some of the Western tribes, they will thank the Eastern tribes because they know the Eastern tribes welcome the sun. It's not just our own little place in the world. That defines us in relationship to the Northeast tribes, to the tribes behind us, all the way to the West Coast. It defines our place on Turtle Island. These practices. As Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, I explain this to people because I've been duly authorized by the tribal government. So if you were to ask me, do you get up every morning and do this? That wouldn't matter. One, it's my personal responsibility and it's my personal religion. Moreover, it is my job to ensure that our people have the opportunity to continue to carry out our traditional practices. I wish I could say that I'm proud to be from this state, but over the last couple months, reading the responses to these editorials and to these articles has given me pause. Because as far as I know, I have not done anything to anybody to warrant the type of responses we have got. And I was surprised, to say the least, that my religious practices could be attacked and questioned. Where is this coming from? Because if anyone or if any people have a right to be a little upset, we had our land stolen from us. There were laws created so we could not own property. Diseases spread among us. And at one time, our traditional people were either put in jail or they were killed in order so we would not be able to do these practices. These very things that we still continue to do. And we wonder why there's not a lot of people out doing these things. I found out why. Because I grew up in the Quechan area. So we were pretty much the town when I was growing up. So these things were unusual to us. It's only when I started talking to other Wampanog that did not live where I live that, yeah, but we don't talk about those things. Suppressed. Is that what this has cost us? Because now, with these laws, we have the right to stand up and say, yes, this is mine. Yes, this is ours. And yes, this is our practice. That's my job. That's my job as Tribal Historic Preservation Officer. That's my job as a tribal member. That is my job as a Wampanoag mother. I think about what our ancestors, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, my parents stood up for. And what they had to let pass along. For me, this is where I draw the line in the sand. This is where I draw the line in the sand. And we'll use the laws and the regulations. And if it comes up on our side, great. Because what happens is when we win, usually everybody else gets to enjoy it too. We're fighting to save this place for our religious practices. And everybody else is going to be able to have a great view. If it goes the other way, there will be other battles. I know that. There always will be. You can't live here for 13,000 plus years and not have traditional cultural properties surrounding you. So if they surround us, they surround all of you too. Thank you for coming this evening, and I'm sure it's going to be an enlightening experience for all.
Dr. King, I think, is the right man at the right time to talk about the right issue. There's no question about that. I found that about Dr. King through the miracle of the internet. Around a year ago, I was Googling to find out more about the Section 106 process. And Dr. King's name kept turning up again and again and again. I decided that this man obviously is an authority. I got the King.
Well, thank you, Neil. And I want to thank everyone, particularly the Wampanoag tribes, for allowing me to be here tonight and giving me the excuse to finally see Cape Cod. I've actually never been on Cape Cod before. And let me also say at the outset that I have no position on Cape Cod. I do have a strong belief, and long have had strong belief, that people are what the National Historic Preservation Act is about, and that what the Act is actually designed to do is protect the interests of American citizens, notably including Native Americans, from being run roughshod over by government actions. I've worked in and around historic preservation, and particularly what we call the Section 106 process, for something over 40 years. And I've worked in government, I've worked outside government, I've worked for tribes. I won't go into my personal history, but about 25 years ago, I was working for the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, which I'll have a little more to say about in a moment. And found myself in a position where it was necessary to write some guidance for the federal government about how to deal with what we have come to call traditional cultural properties. I will take the blame for inventing the term traditional cultural properties. That was not a particularly difficult term to invent. But I'd like to go back. There have been an awful lot of strange statements about traditional cultural properties, about the law, about the Section 106 process, noised about in the newspapers and elsewhere in the media with regard to Cape Wind. And I'd like to step back and try to clarify some basic points. First off, we're talking about a piece of the National Historic Preservation Act. In this venue, it would be very nice to say that the National Historic Preservation Act was a product of the Kennedy administration, but it was not. It was a product of the Lyndon Johnson administration. It was part of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society program, which included a major emphasis on trying to protect the environment, not by necessarily declaring things to be sacrosanct, but by setting up procedures under which people would have to talk to each other before they destroyed aspects of the environment that were precious to people. The National Historic Preservation Act was one of the first pieces of the environmental legislation of the Johnson administration to be enacted. It was enacted in 1966. It's been amended a number of times since then, notably in 1992, when tribal participation was specified in much greater detail than it had been before. What the Act set out to do was it directed the National Park Service to maintain something called the National Register of Historic Places. It also set up an advisory council on historic preservation that would advise the President and Congress on historic preservation matters and oversee what came to be called the Section 106 process. It set up grants to states to establish state historic preservation officers. In this state, it's the Massachusetts Historical Commission. And it directed federal agencies to take into account the effects of their actions on historic properties. The Act has evolved over the years. As of today, we still have the National Register, maintained by the National Park Service. We still have an advisory council in Washington, D.C. We have state and tribal historic preservation officers now, and we have a good deal of direction in the law to federal agencies to consult with tribes and with interested parties of all kinds about the impacts of their actions on places of historic significance. Notably, the Act still contains the Section 106 process, and regulations were issued long ago by the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation about how to carry out the Section 106 process. Section 106 says, in essence, that federal agencies have to take into account the effects of their actions on places included in or eligible for the National Register. Now, I emphasize that we're eligible for part. That was an amendment to the Act that came in the mid-1970s. Prior to that time, before a property could be considered, or before an agency had to even think about its impacts on a historic property, that property had to be literally listed in the National Register of Historic Places. My first job in historic preservation was working for a tribe in California, the Quechan tribe, trying to challenge a Corps of Engineers dam that would be thrown up across a place called Quechan, which is the place where, in the belief of the Quechan people, their ancestors came out of all over the world at the beginning of time. We had to literally sneak onto the project site and compile the documentation to nominate that place to the National Register before it could be considered. We were successful in doing so, but it was a real pain, and it cost the tribe a lot of unnecessary time and money. It also hung up the planning process, because inevitably what happened when things had to be nominated to the National Register is they didn't get listed until rather late in the planning process. Federal agencies tried to keep people from listing things to stay out of trouble. And project opponents would go in and seek to list things. It was a very messy situation. President Nixon fixed it with an executive order that told all agencies to treat anything that was eligible for the National Register as though it were already on. and that language eventually got wrapped into the law itself. The regulations of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation on how federal agencies are to carry out Section 106 review emphasize consultation. Consultation with tribes, consultation with local governments, consultation with anybody who is interested and concerned about impacts on historic properties to try to resolve conflicts. But the regulations also provide that the federal agency, in this case Minerals Management Service, makes the final decision as to whether a project will go forward or not. Now this is different from the way local historic preservation law works. And I think that one reason we've had confusion and disputes in the last few weeks about the so-called designation of Nantucket Sound as a traditional cultural property is that people get confused between local historic preservation laws, kind of laws that the city of Boston has, and the federal historic preservation laws, which are really quite different. In local historic preservation ordinances, you have a very formal process to designate places as landmarks, as historic landmarks. In the federal system, when you get right down to it, designation is irrelevant to the protection or to the management or to decision-making about historic properties. There is very strict protection under local laws. Typically, once something is designated a historic property, a landmark, it is sacrosanct. It cannot be touched. It has to be protected. In the federal system, agencies are simply responsible for taking their effects into account in a particular structured manner. Local preservation laws typically have review commissions with a great deal of power to regulate what's done to historic properties. The federal system has an advisory council that is, as its name implies, advisory. It advises the president, it advises the Congress, and it advises federal agencies. Local systems typically say that you can't change a designated landmark without the permission of the review commission. The federal system leaves that to the discretion of the agency, provided that the agency goes through a program of consultation, analysis, and alternatives consideration. Local designations apply to private citizens and private actions. If I own a house in a designated historic district, there are a lot of things that I can't do to it because the Historic District Commission will get on my case if I paint my house pink or something of the kind. The federal system applies only to federal actions and federal licenses, federal permits, federal grants. So it's important to keep those distinctions understood because the differences are important. The basic idea behind the Section 106 process, the consideration of impacts on historic properties by federal agencies in consultation with interested parties, is the government shouldn't help destroy things that are important to people for historic and cultural reasons, unless it's consulted with them, try to find ways to address their concerns, consider alternatives that will address those concerns, and then reach a reasoned decision based on that consultation. Often we lose that basic idea in the procedural details that have grown up around the Section 106 process, and particularly around the National Register of Historic Places. Now, what is this National Register? It's nothing more than a list. It's a list maintained by the National Park Service. It includes what are called districts, sites, buildings, structures, and objects. They're nominated to the list through the state historic preservation officers. It's a tedious process. It's an onerous process. I don't recommend it. And I don't recommend it because eligible properties get the same consideration under Section 106 as do properties that have actually been listed in the National Register. And eligible simply means that you meet the criteria that have been published by the National Park Service for listing in the register. Actual designation is irrelevant to Section 106 review. Now, a property is eligible for the National Register if first it is a property. It has to be a place. It has to be a piece of real estate or occasionally something like a ship or an airplane. But it basically has to be a place. It has to have integrity, which means it can't be so messed up that it's lost whatever made it significant in the first place. And then it needs to be associated with significant events in the past, as criterion A, patterns of events, or associated with significant people in the past, criterion B, or representative of a type or a style or a school of architecture or something of the kind, that's criterion C, or it has to be a distinguishable entity, that's also part of criterion C, or it has to have the potential to produce important data, that's criterion D. Now we can get all wrapped up in tedious, silly academic arguments about which criterion is met and not met. And we do that all the time. It's what practitioners in this game spend their time doing and make inordinate amounts of money doing. I should say the property also has to not fall into one of several excluded classes, and that all gets so complicated and esoteric that I won't even begin to go into it. So that's what the National Register is, and that's what National Register eligibility is. And what's a traditional cultural property? Traditional cultural property is simply what its name implies. It's a place, a property that figures in somebody's traditional culture. And it's eligible for the National Register if it meets one or more of the National Register criteria. Most traditional cultural properties are found eligible under criterion A for their association with traditional beliefs, traditional culture, traditional history. The term was coined when Patricia Parker of the National Park Service and I wrote a thing called National Register Bulletin 38 back in the late 1980s. Published in 1990. It is most often applied to places important to Native American groups. Indian tribes and Native Hawaiians have been the most active users, if you will, of the traditional cultural property concept, though theoretically it applies to anybody's places. I want to make one thing very clear, if I can, that nobody is authorized by any law to designate a place a traditional cultural property. The Secretary of the Interior does not have the right to say, yes, Wampanoag, your place is a traditional cultural property, or no, it is not. It's not a matter of formally designating something. A place is a traditional cultural property if it figures in a group's traditional culture. It's got to be a piece of property. Somebody has to ascribe cultural value to it, and that value has to somehow be linked to tradition. It's the Sea of Galilee, photographed from the Golan Heights. It's significant. It's a traditional cultural property to that little group of folks called Christians who believe that their spiritual leader walked around on it. Weird beliefs, strange beliefs, but they believe it. And it makes it a very important place, and it makes it difficult for the nations of Israel and Jordan to manage. It really puts a grip in their management. But the fact remains that it is a significant cultural place. Okay, why did we have to write a bulletin about this? Why did we have to write National Register Bulletin 38? There were two cases back in the mid-1980s that led to Bulletin 38. I, at the time, was working for the National Park, for the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, overseeing Section 106 review. I was responsible for overseeing how Section 106 review was done by all the agencies of the federal government nationwide. Patricia Parker, my co-author, was then, as she is now, working for the National Park Service. There were two cases that came up that showed that we had a problem with the way the National Register criteria were being interpreted. One involved the San Francisco Peaks, which we see here in Arizona. The San Francisco Peaks are one of the four corners of the Navajo world. The Navajo regard the San Francisco Peaks as a very, very sacred place. They're also sacred to the Hopi tribe, because to the Hopi it's where the Quechan live. And the Quechan bring rain, the Quechan basically regulate the universe. They're very important spirit beings. The Department of Agriculture Forest Service proposed to issue a license for a ski resort on the upper slopes of the San Francisco Peaks. You may have heard of the San Francisco Peaks in recent years. There's been another case. This is an earlier case. This is back in the 80s. The Forest Service said, okay, we have to comply with Section 106, so we have to find out if we're going to have any impacts on historic properties. They sent archaeologists up on the peaks, and they didn't find anything. So they said, well, there's nothing there, so we have nothing to deal with. The Navajo said, of course there's nothing there. The peaks are so sacred, we never go up there. The Hopi said, of course there's nothing you can see there. The Quechan don't leave things that archaeologists can find. But the Forest Service at that time, under the regulations that were then in force, was able to go ahead and say it's not eligible for the National Register because we and the State Historic Preservation Officer agree that since our archaeologists can't find anything, it's not eligible. It was determined not eligible, even though it went to court, and the project proceeded. That didn't seem right. That didn't seem right because the interests of the people, the interests of the tribe, were simply being ignored, utterly disrespected. Now, it may be that the ski resort was the thing to do. Maybe it was a perfectly viable project. But we, my co-author and I felt, and we were able to sell this to the Advisory Council of the National Park Service in the Reagan administration, we felt that the people's views shouldn't be so disregarded. About the same time, there was Pole Town in Detroit, Michigan. The city of Detroit had money from the Department of Housing and Urban Development to help put in a new Cadillac plant. And to do that, they had to take out a whole Polish-American neighborhood that had been there for 100 years or so. The people of Pole Town didn't want to go. And they argued that their neighborhood was eligible for the National Register. HUD and the city of Detroit said, no, it doesn't have any great architecture, so it's not eligible. And they were able to get away with that. And the people of Pole Town, though they chained themselves to the doors of their cathedral, were dragged out and their neighborhood was razed. Again, maybe the Cadillac plant was the thing to do, but we didn't feel like their interests should be so totally disrespected in the process. So we ended up writing this bulletin that advises agencies about how this kind of property, which has been found eligible for the National Register repeatedly in the past, ought to be dealt with, how it ought to be, how such places ought to be evaluated. Basically, the guidelines say they're basically aimed at federal agencies, and they go through page after page after page of bureaucratic nonsense, the kind of stuff that government agencies write, and people like me who work for government agencies write. But what it all comes down to, the bottom line is you ask the people. If people think that a place is significant, you treat it as significant, and you consult with them about it. Well, as soon as Bulletin 38 was issued, it was rejected by three major agencies, the Bureau of Land Management, the Forest Service, and of all people, the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Sent out guidance to their field offices saying, this is a National Park Service publication, you don't have to deal with it. That really irritated a lot of tribes and a lot of intertribal organizations. And the result was the tribes went to the Hill and talked to members of Congress, and when the National Historic Preservation Act was amended in 1992, there was a new section, Section 101D6, that made it clear, said flatly, that tribal places, didn't call them TCPs, traditional cultural properties, called them places of cultural and religious significance, but same thing, said that they could be eligible for the register, and that agencies must consult with tribes about their impacts on such places. This was nothing more than a reminder. It was nothing more than a slap on the wrist to these three recalcitrant agencies, because these kind of properties had been determined eligible for the register as long as there'd been a register, but agencies were getting drifted away from it. Now, I can't resist shilling my book a little bit. I have a book that came out in 2003 that goes into great detail about traditional cultural properties, and I'd certainly recommend it to you. It's from Altamira Press. But it is entirely unofficial. It's what I think. It's not what the National Park Service thinks. I want to show a few examples of properties that have been determined eligible as traditional cultural properties around the country. This is part of the Hellcow Historic District in Northern California. It's a place where local tribes, the Tolowa, the Hupa, the Yurok, and the Karuk, believe there's a hole in the sky, and wisdom comes down to their elders, to their medicine people, when they go up there and pray. And in connection with the proposed Forest Service road through the area, the Hellcow Historic District was determined eligible for the National Register back in the mid-1970s. This one is Cave Rock in Nevada, very important place for the Washoe tribe. A natural rock, got a hole in it, not only a cave over here on the one side, the highway tunnel on the other side, but still a very significant place in the beliefs and traditions of the Washoe people. The Forest Service in this case has recently, about 2 years ago now, come to the conclusion that it should forbid rock climbers from climbing on Cave Rock, in part because of the offense that it gave to the tribe. This case went to court because rock climbers immediately challenged it under the First Amendment to the Constitution. It said the federal government here is establishing Washoe religion, and that's against the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment to the Constitution. The court disagreed, and the case went to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and the Ninth Circuit upheld the decision. This is my first Section 106 case, Dogfish Canyon in California, where the beliefs of the Cahuilla people, their ancestors, came out of the lower world at the beginning of time. This was determined eligible with the first National Register in connection with the proposed Corps of Engineers dam, which was later abandoned. This is a place called Mount Tonaachaw in Chuuk, an island group in Micronesia that is a state for purposes of the National Historic Preservation Act, so they participate under the National Historic Preservation Program. In the beliefs of the Chuukese people, their culture founder, Tonaachaw, came in the form of a cosmic frigate bird to the top of that mountain, the Achow, and established his meeting house from which he spread culture throughout the lagoon. It's on the National Register as a traditional cultural property. These sandbars are in the Rio Grande in New Mexico, just outside of Albuquerque on the edge of San Diego Pueblo. San Diego Pueblo people immerse themselves in the river water on these sandbars in connection as part of religious rituals. This became an issue a few years ago when there was a proposal to put in a housing project that would pump sewage through a sewage treatment plant into the river upstream of the sandbars. And the tribe said, wait a minute, you're going to be pumping sewage into the area where we immerse ourselves. That's a real serious problem. They alleged that the sandbars were eligible for the National Register. The project proponents and the federal agency involved, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, said nonsense. They're not traditional cultural properties because, A, we don't believe you really carry out rituals there, and B, the sandbars probably didn't even exist until a dam was built upstream to change the flow regime in the river. Well, the matter went to the keeper of the National Register, just as Nanntucket Sound is the keeper now. And the tribe brought in their own ethnographer to talk about how they did indeed carry out rituals on the sandbar, and they brought in aerial photographs showing the sandbar in place before the dam was built. At that point, the keeper determined the property is eligible. Anderson Air Force Base on the island of Guam keeps this whole area of rainforest pristine protects it as a National Register eligible traditional cultural property because the local Chamorro people gather traditional medicine there that's important in their spiritual life and in their native medicine. Here are a couple of rather big traditional cultural properties. That's Mount Shasta over there, the pointy one. Mount Shasta in its entirety is a traditional cultural property to a lot of Northern California groups. There's been a silly argument about what its boundaries are, but the tribes believe that the whole mountain is sacred, and it has been determined eligible for the National Register. The area in the foreground is a huge volcanic caldera called the Medicine Lake Highlands, and it's been in and out of court for quite a while, but it has been determined eligible for the National Register as a traditional cultural property because of its significance, particularly to the Pit River tribe. And Pit River people have been successful in stopping a geothermal development project that would affect this landscape. This is called the Trail of Dreams. I can't possibly get a picture of the whole thing because it's too big. It's a system of trails and prayer circles and a whole variety of things that stretches all the way from Mexico to Los Angeles. And in the belief of the Quechan tribe on the lower Colorado River, they travel along, they and their ancestors travel along this trail, not only physically, but in their dreams, to get to other worlds and gain knowledge. This area was determined eligible for the National Register by the Bureau of Land Management, and a proposed gold mine that was going to go in the middle of this landscape was ultimately halted after Section 106 review during the Clinton administration. It's a long political story from there, but it ultimately has been halted permanently. This is a place called Wishkagagamonsebi. I love the fact that I can pronounce that. It's an Ojibwe word, meaning little river of medicines. And it's a landscape just east of the Mole Lake Sokagan Ojibwe Reservation. It's made up of a number of parts. Rice Lake, where they grow wild rice, a number of springs where they collect very, very pure water for use in ceremonies, the rapids where they fish, Spirit Hill, associated, as you can imagine, with spirits, a variety of hunting areas, and so on. This whole area, in connection with the proposed mine that was going to go in the middle of it, was determined eligible for the National Register as the Wishkagagamonsebi Historic District. Klamath River in California. I worked a few years ago for the Klamath River Intertribal Fish and Water Commission to do a study showing that the entire river, from the dams upstream down to the Pacific coast, was eligible for the National Register, and that the fish, the salmon that migrate up the river, are an important contributing element to its historic significance. That was accepted by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in the 106 case. Now, there are other laws that we need to be aware of that apply to this kind of situation. One is the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which says that the federal government will do nothing to significantly burden anyone's practice of religion unless there is a compelling government reason to do so. The American Indian Religious Freedom Act says that the federal government will respect the inherent right of American Indian tribes to the free exercise of their traditional religions. The National Environmental Policy Act says that we've got to take into account the effects of our actions on all aspects of the environment. And there are several executive orders, all actually from the Clinton administration, interestingly enough. One having to do requiring consultation with tribes on policy making, another protecting Indian sacred sites on federal land, and another dealing with environmental justice, not running roughshod over the interests of low-income and minority groups. Now, none of these require or turn on National Register eligibility. One more case that I want to talk about, because it's a recent case that I think has some implications for Nantucket Sound. Medicine Bluff at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. This is a painting of a historical scene in Medicine Bluff. This is what it looks like today. It's on Fort Sill, an Army base, and this is a schematic with also the title of the court case that's been settled recently. So there's Medicine Bluffs sticking up out of the ground, and everyone knew, and this area has been regarded as significant, is regarded as eligible for the National Register for many years, because it was known that the Comanche carried out some kind of religious practices on Medicine Bluffs, that it was wrapped up in their religion. Well, the Army proposed to put in a new training support center, not on Medicine Bluffs, but down on the low ground around it, about half a mile away. Well, the Army said, we've got to do Section 106 review, so what do? We'll do an archaeological survey. They did an archaeological survey. They didn't find anything. They said, we have no impact on historic properties. The only historic property around here is Medicine Bluffs, and it's over there. We're not going to hit it, so we don't have a problem. They began building their training support center. Well, then the Comanche said, wait a minute. We do carry out religious rituals up on top of the bluffs, and they involve looking out over the landscape. It's very important to our religious rituals that we have an unimpeded natural landscape out there. Moreover, we stand on the other side and look back toward the bluffs when we pray. And it's very important to have that view unimpeded too. And you guys are putting up your training support center right in the middle of our viewscape that's absolutely critical to our religious practices. Well, the result was that the court issued a preliminary injunction. The court found that there was a possible violation of Section 106 of NHPA and the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And the court halted construction pending a trial. Well, the Army could see the handwriting on the wall, and it walked. It has given up the project. So this case will never go actually to trial. But it's a pretty good indication of what courts can say about projects like this that fall not right on a traditional cultural property, but in the view shape of a traditional cultural property. The court found that the disruption of the sight lines imposed a substantial burden on religious practice, and the government couldn't do it under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act without showing that it had a compelling government interest. The court also found that consultation was inadequate under the National Historic Preservation Act, that the tribe hadn't been properly informed, that data about the project were buried in all kinds of technical appendices that no reasonable person could be expected to read. The tribe wasn't informed of cumulative impacts. And the tribe, when it objected after an arbitrarily defined deadline, their comments were rejected as untimely and ignored. The court found all of those things to be inappropriate. And the court said this wonderful thing. Section 106 requires an agency to stop, look, and listen. The evidence in the present case suggests that defendants merely paused, glanced, and turned a deaf ear to warnings of adverse impact. But it's important to understand that under Section 106, maybe not under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, but under Section 106, the Army could have completed the project and been in compliance with the law if it had consulted with the tribes and everybody else who might be concerned, if it had recognized the impacts, if it had sought to resolve them, and if it wasn't able to resolve them, if it had gotten the comments of the Advisory Council and paid attention to those comments. But if after doing all those things it decided that the need for the project justified going ahead, it could have done that. In the same way, if Nanntucket Sound is found eligible for the National Register as a traditional cultural property or as an airplane or a ship or anything else, if the Secretary of the Interior decides in the end that wind power is more important than the cultural beliefs of the Wampanog people, Secretary can say, sorry, Wampanoag, we're going to put the thing in.